recorded for posterity. So today's seminar is the third in our 7 seminars of urban geopolitics seminar series, which is also part of the Urban Geopolitics doctoral school associated with the Ukrainian geopolitical fault line cities, Urban Identity, Geopolitics, and Urban Policy project, which is funded by the Research Council of Norway and which is led by myself. Today's speaker is Dr. Nadir Kinossian from the Leibniz Institute for Regional Geography, which is located in Leipzig in Germany. We're very grateful to have you here, Nadir. And Nadir is a well-known scholar who has written plentifully and very deeply about a wide range of topics, which range from authoritarian modernization in Russia through the politics of heritage construction, spatial planning, and strategies in peripheral areas, especially up in the Arctic. And most recently, the development patterns and prospects of old industrial regions in Europe. And the latter is the topic of his ongoing research project, which is called Agents of Change in Old Industrial Regions in Europe, and which is funded by the Volkswagen Foundation. So Nadir has an admirable multidisciplinary background that makes him much more of an all-around scholar than most of us. He has a master's degree in urban planning. He has another master's degree in political science. He has the kind of real-world experience that most academics lack. He's worked as a planner for some time, and he has a PhD, not least, in city and regional planning from the University of Cardiff. So after gaining his PhD, he spent several years in, excuse me, northern Norway, working at the University of Tromsø, at the Barents Institute in Kirkenes. And these are places that are further to the north than you can probably even imagine. And since 2015, he has been based in Leipzig at the Leibniz Institute of Regional Geography, where he has been gradually Teutonizing. So Nadir's talk is entitled The Post-Industrial Town, Urban Identity Between the Local and the Global. And it promises to be a rather comprehensive account of how particularly urban identities are studied, formed, and structured. So I'll leave the word to him now, but before doing so, please let me remind you that it is important that those of you who are in the Zoom room should keep themselves muted. Otherwise, you'll show up every time you cough or move or whatever. So we'll start with Nadir's talk, and after that, we will proceed to the discussion part, which will not be streamed live on YouTube. Nadir's talk will be, on the other hand, and for those of you who are following it there, you will be able to ask questions in the chat field, and hopefully we'll be able to return to them, but honestly, I can't really guarantee that. So, Nadir, bitte.
Danke, Mike. Thanks a lot, Mike, for your kind words and introduction. And thanks a lot, the organizers, for organizing this series of events. And I hope that will continue. And I look forward to participating in subsequent seminars and talks. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Mike has kindly introduced myself, so I will now try to introduce our institute in a few words. So the Leibniz Institute for Regional Geography is located in Leipzig, and we are independent. We do research on human geography, cartography, and history and theory of geography. We are also a member of the EGA campus, which is Eastern Europe Global Arena, and follow us on Twitter or the internet. You can see the funding announcements, and you can in our funding programs, and you can come to Leipzig or Jena or Halle as a visiting scholar, and we can try to develop some joint projects. So these are Twitter accounts of myself, the Institute, and the campus. So to the topic of the talk, the post-industrial town urban identity between the local and the global. You see that there are at least three key concepts: the post-industrial town, identity, and global and local. You may wonder how these three may be connected. And these connections indeed are of growing interest in human geography, because scholars are looking for non-economistic explanations of development outcomes and behavior, things like culture, identities, personal psychology, influence in behavior of ordinary people, and agents of change leading to certain development outcomes. And we could speculate that the success of some places can be explained by these local things like identity and culture, and feelings of belonging, and the way people interact with each other. That's a developing and interesting area that denies simple economistic explanations that people are incentivized by material interests, and these explanations are trying to look into the deeper substance of human behavior. There is also ongoing debate on opening the local to broader interpretations via different scala levels and networks and flows. So talking about local doesn't make so much sense, because the local is exposed to changing market conjunctures and changing supply and demand lines, and political change that affects localities, cities, and regions. And the discussion is if those places are simply leaves in the wind of global change, or they have some kind of capacity to change their future through some action. So urban identity, that is indeed a complex and interesting topic. The most interesting thing is the question whether we talk about identity of people or identity of places. And all the data that we normally use in our research refers to people, like income, training, and employment, etc. So this data is collected at personal level. But does that mean that it can lead to the identity of a place? We sum up that identities of individuals. Does it form the identity of the place? And another way around, if there is some kind of shared understanding of identity, is it shared universally by every resident that happened to be residing in this place? Next point is singular or plural identities, and it is also a question whether we can talk about the identity of a post-industrial town or region. The identities appear to be multiple and overlapping or conflictual, so there is a multitude of identities that are produced and supported and promoted by various groups depending on their position and their roots and their understanding of various aspects of political and social and cultural life. Exogenous or endogenous is identity created organically within the place, or is it created through the interaction with other places? Can an identity be imposed on a place, or does it have to be created locally and be considered as some product of local processes? Identity as fixed notion or a constant process of change described as identification? These are the questions that make the topic of identity extremely complex and extremely interesting. So that leads to the structure of the presentation. I will talk about elements of identity or elements of identity discourses. Then I will try to connect these discourses that happen to be mostly operating at the macro level to the local level, which is not an easy task. And then I will try to talk about the identity of post-industrial town. So what is an identity? So the definition of Cambridge Dictionary is who a person is, or the qualities of a person or a group that make them different from others. That could be easy if people had one identity, but because we have multiple identities, it is difficult to imagine that kind of singular, static, or solid thing that can be described as identity. Also, the Dictionary of Human Geography suggests that it makes more sense to talk about identification as a process of constant search for the image of a result self. There are different approaches or schools of thought, and there are at least three of them that can be grouped as primordialism, that suggests that identities are kind of fixed and eternal and can be passed through generation to generation. Instrumentalism, that suggests that instrumentalism and constructivism, that identities are changing and constructed, and instrumentalism emphasizes the use of identity for purpose, and constructivism, the process of creating an identity. Well, in a way, modern debate suggests that there is consensus over these differences, and we seem to be all constructivists now, as suggests Brubaker. So to the classical pieces, so to say, following that constructivist paradigm, that, as Anderson claimed, nations are imagined political communities. Well, for a simple reason that people simply do not know many or most of the people who they think share that community with them. Then Anthony Smith developed that further, producing 5 elements such as historic territory, common myths and historical memories, common culture, common legal framework, and common economic space. As for territory, territory is considered as the most tangible element of nation existence. That's why territory is so important in identity discourses at the macro level, because nation can only exist within a fixed territorial borders. One can argue that there may be other associations of people, not necessarily territorial, but this is difficult to imagine in practical sense because of various reasons, from security to economic activities. Point is heritage and the use of the past for the current purposes. There is literature on how the past is created through modern discourses and activities, how these activities select useful elements of the past to create the official frame of heritage. And the last reference to the list of the classics, so to say, is a reference to Philip Reuter book, where nation states come from, is that to achieve sovereignty, achieve secession, there should be political identity hegemony, which means that most of the people should sort of accept that idea, and then it has to be empowered through institutions and political activities. So in a way, that constructivist state can be summarized that identities are created and then used for political mobilization. That can be a cynical interpretation, and this is not to say that things like patriotism are meaningless. In fact, they are very important, and the sense of community is important, and the sense of shared mutual responsibility is important for every society to function. So next step is how to connect these macro level discourses to the local, and that's not an easy task, because these big discourses seem to have homogenizing tendency, and they seem to ignore regional variations and enormous variations at the regional level and supranational, at the subnational level. And because places and regions are different in terms of their income, economic profile, economic development, in terms of their cultures, and in terms of their human capital and various other things, there is a true issue of transferring this kind of identity discourse to the local level or the regional level. Yeah, as I said, because of the homogenizing aspect of this macro level concepts like nation and national identity and territory. But I suggest that we could look at the local identity through at least 3 lenses, so to say. The symbolic, this is how big discourses can be translated through symbolic manifestation, through architecture and urban planning. We can look at the cultural dimension, things like the sense of community, belonging, spatialized cultures, and we can look through the agentic lens to see how places and localities and regions are branded, promoted, how policies are used to achieve certain developmental outcomes. Probably the symbolic lens is the most kind of obvious because of the extensive use of architecture and monumental art in various forms of as the author put it, manipulative exercises, so that the image of images contained in architecture kind of translate this narrative and discourses of history, past, nation, etc. Culture appears to be the most complex and probably most important element of understanding local identity. And Anssi Pasi has written extensively on these aspects. And in his book from 1996, he talks about spatial belonging and processes of bordering and othering, that we within certain spatial boundaries identify us, and those who live across the border are identified as them. Again, these processes of spatial socialization take place within specific territorially bounded entities. And here we talk about education and everyday experiences, habits, norms that exist in one place but may be different in a different place. So this socialized processes or spatially socialized processes are important for forming identity, forming norms that we can behave in a place, and we would understand what is normal, acceptable, what is not acceptable. And we would share some understanding that we absorb through education and other forms of socialization, that certain things seem to be true in this place and may not necessarily be acceptable in other places. Yeah, as I said in the beginning, in economic geography, this is also a growing area of research on spatial cultures and personal psychology that are used as explanatory factors in understanding human behavior. And that can be a more complex an explanation than a simple traditional explanation based on economic incentives. The people are not necessarily always rational in their behavior. They may their behavior may be influenced by other things that we struggle to conceptualize and operationalize, because they belong to that, world of sentiment, feelings, and things that are not necessarily numerical, but nonetheless, people are looking at these things, and studies try to understand how things like culture or trust or hierarchies, interaction between people affect economic life. The last lens that I suggest as an approach to understanding local identity is agentic lens. We would look at different groups and different interests that they promote through interpreting places as they think is most suitable. So different groups, on the basis of their socio-geographical position, as Dorin Massey explains it, can create spatial narratives of places and sort of create this identity of a place. But these interpretations can be different, mutually exclusive, conflictual, because the people who promote or create them are different. That's why Dorin Massey suggests that we should not look at places as some kind of fixed dot on maps, but as articulation of social relations and different interests and effectively constructed stories about places. Well, this is more economic geography reference on the agentic power, how different narratives of places influence policy and lead to different developmental outcomes. And this is a story of San Francisco and Los Angeles, where local agents pursued different interpretations of the economic role of their cities that led to different outcomes. This is also an illustration how different narratives of place can have implications. Speaking of the industrial or post-industrial town, we usually talk about things such as path dependency and lock-ins. And that means that industrial towns often have a strong specialization in one industry. And when the industry collapses or goes into decline, that leads to extremely painful consequences for individuals, families, the whole community. And the challenge for industrial towns or post-industrial towns is to overcome those lock-ins that can be functional, which is effectively specialization, which can be cognitive, which is a view of their place in the world, or political, which is the political machinery attached to facilitating economic and political processes. And the notion of lock-in means that these places are locked in certain mindset, a certain profile or function, or certain politics that prevents them from exploring or exploiting new development paths. So that's why post-industrial places and localities often are stuck in their traditional established path and have enormous difficulties developing a new path, breaking away from the old specialization. And here the question of culture and identity plays a role. For instance, there are different interpretations of all industrial places. Some argue that they are the smartest places on earth because they have this deep understanding, knowledge of certain sectors, which can be translated into new areas of specialization. They have highly trained workforce, they have engineers who are creative and can apply their training and knowledge in different areas. But others argue that it may not be the case because modern Fordist, or not so modern, Fordist economy divided all tasks in such a way that everybody knew just one segment of this big work package, and created a workforce that is absolutely not interested and doesn't have any comprehension of the entire process. That's why they are, basically mechanical in their work approach, which creates enormous difficulty for any retraining or redeployment program that such workers may need. And this has implication for politics and has implication for the future of industrial regions and cities, because if there is a large number of people who may not be willing or may not be able to find new skills or be retrained, then that creates a potentially unhappy and number of voters or number of citizens who do not see a meaningful place for themselves in the changing economy, and an economy that does not require their skills anymore. I would like now to illustrate what was said by using the example of Svalbard, the mining towns in Svalbard. That's in a way an interesting case. But on the other hand, it is problematic because we lack, so to say, local community because of the fluidity of labor force. But we can see how discourses of generated in mainland can be translated into the local level. And I looked at Longyearbyen as the capital of Svalbard and Barentsburg as the capital of the Russian part of Svalbard. Barentsburg is kind of reproduction of the Soviet discourses of informed, ideologically informed, and effectively designed to create a showcase of Soviet progressive modern economy, kind of a real representation of labor and working conditions that see in Longyearbyen, that through monumental art, different stories of places very similar structurally are produced. So if we compare Longyearbyen and Barentsburg and look at symbolic aspect or symbolic lengths, it's much more human-oriented representation of hard labor of the worker whereas on the Soviet side or the Russian side, it's some kind of heroic representation of Soviet worker. In terms of culture, both places kind of miss it because of the fluidity of the labor force, so that they don't have a community in a traditional sense. But on the Norwegian side, it's much more diverse and globalized, whereas on the Russian side, more homogeneously post-Soviet, since the labor comes mostly from Russia and Ukraine. In that sense, it represents the kind of historical divisions of between the Soviet and capitalist world. On the agentic side, on the Norwegian side, there is a multiplicity of agents and attempts to create a sense of community. Whereas on the Russian side, there is a singularity of agency represented by the administration of the mine that effectively creates discourses about the past and the future. Conclude, I would like to mention the following. Post-industrial towns or locations also have manifestations of big identity discourses. So that's probably not avoidable in any place. The identity of people can be derived from their class belonging, local cultures, and that has to be studied empirically. That is a changing and fluid matter that we cannot simply speculate about. Also, identity of post-industrial town is influenced heavily by material factors such as path dependency, industrial heritage, Lockins. In that sense, we can probably speculate that a place with a strong specialization would have certain features that a place with diverse economy would not have. We can also think of identity as anticipated, as an area of political interests and political visions, where different groups promote different visions of the place and different futures. Identities are also formed externally, and often this is some sort of derogative and stigmatizing approach to framing places as Rust Belt city or left behind city, which may not necessarily be shared by the residents. It is, it originates in some policy circles or scientific circles, but when you travel to a place and you try to use it, it's rejected by the people who don't see themselves as necessarily Rust Belt or left behind or place in decline or decay. And finally, we probably have to deal with multiplicity and fluidity of identities as places respond to changing economic and political environments. And this can be a painful process because people want to have some kind of stable understanding or some kind of, understandable feeling of belonging to certain larger group. But when economic environment suddenly changes, that has, repercussions for individuals, their families, and regions, and the national level, because that transformation or adjustment to changing environment may not be an easy task, in both material and also cultural and personal sense. So I would stop at this point, and I think it's already quite a long talk. And I would thank you for your attention. I would be happy to